Hi everyone, welcome back to the 5710 podcast, this time with Nick Hayhurst from Hayhurst and Co, which is an award-winning London-based architectural studio established in 2004 by Nick Hayhurst and Jonathan Nichols. Through their diverse portfolio, they have established a reputation for designing environments that are sensitive and sustainable, innovative and humane, and refined and delightful. Nick has taught and lectured widely and is a senior lecturer at the University of Brighton, where he specialises in design theory and practice. Nick is also a professional examiner at the CAS and the Bartlett, and an external examiner here at the Scott Sutherland School. How was your journey up today?
It was a little bit late, but absolutely fine. I mean, it's actually not that far.
No, it's kind of a miserable day to be in Aberdeen.
It is, but also the way that a lot of us work, it's just continuously just doing stuff on your laptop and
exactly.
phoning and doing stuff anyway, so it doesn't feel like I've come a particularly long way.
Is this the first time you've been in Aberdeen, or have you already done?
No. I've been in Aberdeen a number of times before. Both in terms of doing RIBA validation board here many years ago, and a conference here, and I was up here in June this year as well.
Oh, okay. So it's not new to you.
No, I've been both to your old school of architecture, just up the road, and I've been to this building as well before. But also I did my part one at Edinburgh College of Art, kind of back in the day. Yeah. So I've lived in Scotland for 4 years. So, yeah.
So speaking about the validation, and you seem to do quite a lot of extracurricular stuff. Is that quite extracurricular? Yeah. Is that quite important to you, but also as the architectural profession, like as a whole, kind of?
I do. I mean, I think it's quite it's a symbiotic kind of set of relationships that kind of take place. So you're right. I mean, I do a number of design review panels, as well as the various kind of educational things. I mean, when I set up my practice 14 years ago, it was around the same time that I started teaching, and I think over the last 14 years, there's always been a case of being engaged and interested in education as much as being in practice, and I don't really see them as two separate things. Yeah. I see them as one part of an architectural life and an architectural profession. But also, I think there are some incredibly strong this symbiotic or kind of relationships between those two, and so the act of teaching and the relation and what teaching does back to your practice and what practice does back to teaching, not in terms of direct skills or knowledge, but in an ability to reflect and an ability to challenge yourself in terms of what you're doing. And I think that as I said downstairs, for the first 5 years of practice, I think we were still very much working out what we were doing and what architects do. And I think that if I hadn't been teaching, I was running a third year kind of studio at Brighton for most of those 5 years, as well as running a practice. And I think that if I hadn't had that that relationship between kind of teaching and practicing and working out who I was at that particular point in time, I think it would have been difficult not to have education and teaching and those sets of kind of other activities kind of going on. But I also think in terms of kind of feeding back what you do in terms of being in different education environments, giving lectures, design review panels. It makes a professional life, I would argue, more fulfilling and giving it more variety and is healthy.
So as part of Hayhurst and Co, you work on a lot of school buildings. I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard that it's quite difficult to get into designing school buildings because it can be quite a selective process. So how did your company get involved in that?
So the very first schools that we did many years ago were very small projects for directly for schools. So there were no local authorities involved, there were no academy trusts involved, and it was where you were working directly with schools' own devolved funding. Okay. So they might have had, saved up 100 grand or 150 grand from their own devolved funding from the local authority and wanted to do something interesting. Yeah, okay. And so we started off doing the types of school projects where you didn't have to be on a big framework and you didn't have to have done 15 of them before to be able to get into it. And then after having done a number of those very small projects, what we did, actually the first ones came about from doing a competition. And it was an open competition, and I think we came, and then we got shortlisted, and then we came second, and it was for a children's centre in South London. And then the head teacher of that school then spoke to the head teacher of the school down the road and said, well, these guys didn't win, but we think they'll be quite good to work with, so you might want to use them. And so we did. And that was the very first project of Whitehorse Infants, which then ended up being Whitehorse School's Pegasus Academy, which then went and won an RIBA award and then architecture review. And then we were working with the local authority, working with Croydon, who then asked us to look at other schools. And then at that point, you then have enough of a repertoire and enough of a catalogue behind you to be able to go and do other things. But I think it's all about stars aligning at the right point and the right time, and the right people having conviction and belief in you. And I think unless you can forge those sets of relationships, and the head teacher who we worked with at Whitehorse, after we'd complete that little project, he didn't have to phone us up and say, I want you to do the master plan because I want to can I be progressing this, and can I and was very much behind us all the way. And unless I think over the last 14 years there's been a number of people professionally who have been like that to us. And I think unless you forge those relationships and you make those connections with people, it's very difficult.
And then on the other side of your practice, there's quite a lot of houses. How do you approach the two quite different briefs and ideas behind how you design them?
I mean, they are quite different. I mean, in our studio, they're all mixed up. So we don't have one side of the studio doing schools and one side of the studio doing houses. I think it is. I think I'm right in saying everybody in our office is working on both. And I think that's and I think it's important both for kind of intellectual engagement, I think for richness of professional life, and I think for also making sure you don't get too lazy, intellectually lazy, not practically lazy, in terms of just being comfortable, in terms of being able to kind of continue to challenge yourself and to work on different types of projects in different sectors, I think is really important. But I think hopefully in the lecture, what I also tried to communicate was actually some of the similarities in terms of the architectural themes that move through both the education projects and the houses. And quite often I think it's actually it's just about good design, responding to different types of context, whether it be a physical context, a cultural context, a social context, or an educational philosophy in terms of how a particular school want to teach and want to operate, in the same way that an education brief in terms of how people want to live and how people want to live in their home. And what it is, it's about the same skill set, which is about listening and interpretation, rather than necessarily about understanding a sector's set of particular guidances, and then that's
because then it gets a bit restrictive, doesn't it, if you're just looking at it in that sort of way.
Well, I think I think probably some practices do, and they but I think at that point you're then beginning to churn. And I think I also talked about in this lecture this issue, or this idea that every practice operates somewhere between the factory and the laboratory. And where are you on that? Where do you fit? And also, it's quite common, I think, for practices to vary where they sit on that within different projects. And to say there are some projects here which are really interesting, which I'm going to focus and be quite kind of laboratory-like. But also commercially, we have a monthly, like every practice, there's a certain amount of numbers that need to come through the bank account every month. And actually, we have to have a commercial emphasis because everybody needs to be paid, and we need to run as secure a business as we can.
The kind of factory ones can help do more laboratory.
Invariably,
How do you kind of see the architectural profession changing in the future and adapting to economical and political, but also technological advancements?
Well, there's the question of how I would like it to develop or how it might develop are two quite different things. Well, they may be different things, who knows. I think one of the challenges, I mean, our profession has changed enormously over the last 40 years. And in many ways, the way we operate, we're actually quite as a profession, we're quite new to the way in which we operate compared to many others. So, if you think in the mid to late 70s, almost 50% of the architects in this country were employed in state sector employment by local authorities, by central government. And, the GLC was the largest employer of architects in this country. I think it was even the largest employer in the world, a single employer of architects. I might have got that figure, I might have got that wrong.
I'll fact check it.
Yeah, you fact check that. And actually, I think it's now something like 2 or 3% of architects now work for local authority bodies. It may be less. It may be less than that. But what that means is that over the last 20 or 30 years, we've actually had to work out who we are and how we operate as a private profession. In quite the same way that we didn't have to before. But also there's this thing about private sector doing public works, which again, 30 years ago, 35 years, it would always be local authorities, doing those types of social housing, doing schools, doing healthcare buildings, all of those types of things would have been done by a certain set of architects with a particular set of ethos. The issue that we have for architecture in this country now is that type of civic infrastructure, which is absolutely essential to the way that we live and we operate and which the city works, is now being driven by commercial forces, and quite often done by contractor-led commercial forces who don't necessarily always have the same sets of priorities and interests and KPIs, key performance indicators that a state sector kind of led profession might have done. And so I think how we as a profession procure and produce public sector work, which is good, is challenging. I think also running parallel with that is from the 90s, early 90s onwards, is then design and build, and how that affects what we do. And it's quite interesting, actually. I think increasingly clients are becoming a little bit annoyed by design and build and the lack of control it has. And interestingly, looking at kind of like Part 3 case studies and things like this, actually there's an increasing number of Part 3 case studies for decent sized projects where they are actually becoming either traditionally procured or they're done through some other form of management contracting or partnering arrangements, which begins to signal perhaps there is beginning to be a change or a slight kind of shift within some types of clients, but we'll see how that kind of comes through. And I think Grenfell highlighted some of those sets of issues as well, in terms of the way in which the oversight and both the kind of the intellectual and professional oversight of projects and how procurement has an impact on that.
When you're working in the office or maybe in university, what's kind of your favourite memory from your architectural career? Or favourite story, whether from uni or in the said workplace?
Oh my gosh, that's a question, isn't it? My favourite moments. I think there was a very nice moment, probably about 7 or 8 years ago, when I did a little design for a community centre on the estate where I live in South London. And at that point I was chair of the Tenants and Residents Association, and with the local councillors managed to scrub up some money which they gave us to convert the old laundry room, which the cleaner had as a massive kind of hoarding space, and actually very simply kind of refurbish it. And what was interesting is that a council surveyor had come along and said, yes, it will cost £50,000 to do this, and they were putting carpets down there and some kind of institutional ramp, and it was going to be pretty horrible. And I said, save yourself that, I'll do the work pro bono. We did it. We managed to bring it in for the same budget. I think actually we had £1,500 left at the end. And what we did is that we cleared out the space. We actually refurbished the really nice 1960s tiles. We didn't go and take them all up and put a load of carpet down. We actually just ever so slightly altered with the floor levels rather than building a ramp.
Yeah.
And instead of putting PVC windows in, because all the previous ones were rotten, got one of the best joinery yards that we've worked with, and we actually did some really nice bespoke big back doors, which is where most of the money went. And I think it was that sense of actually that control over destiny, because whilst we were architects and whilst I wasn't paying for it because it was coming through various funds, effectively I had design control as a client type body, and so long as it came in on budget, the local authority were happy, and as long as I wasn't doing stupid things with the money. And actually there was that sense of, there was a new sense of responsibility, because it wasn't as though I was just an architect trying to push things and relying on the client body to kind of push back and have that kind of, not tension, but to have that kind of relationship where you're kind of figuring each other out to work out what you can do here. Is that there was a level of kind of personal responsibility, and that you had to do a bit of self-measurement and a bit of kind of self-control over what you're doing. And actually, I think the project was better for it, in the fact that there was a level of measure which I had to apply to my own work rather than just trying to push it out. And interestingly, when that year we'd completed 6 projects, and at the Christmas, our little office trip was going around 6 projects that we'd done around London, and we went there. And not many people from the office had been there because I'd been doing it. It was virtually next door to where I live. And we were like, this is so simple, but actually so lovely. And actually it was a real eye-opening and defining moment there, actually.
So it's almost time to wrap up. So one last question. A student of architecture might go on a grand tour of like, best buildings or whatever. So what would your recommendation for either a city or a building or both that they should visit?
So one of the, within Europe, it gets a lot of not bad press, a lot of hassle as being tourist, but Barcelona is one of my favourites, and the Gaudi, sure, but actually there's some really amazing Enric Morales buildings, and actually if you get in a car or go out about, I don't know, it's about an hour or so outside of Barcelona, there's a wonderful cemetery called the Igualada Cemetery that he did. I remember going there as a student, and I've taken students there since, and it is one of the most spatially, narratively, materially rich projects that I can think of. I think Paris has a lot going for it. But recently, a couple of years ago, I was in Colombia and in Bogota, and there was an amazing housing scheme called Park House, I think, by a Bogota architect. Or actually, I don't think he actually was. He might have been French originally, whose name I'm going to get wrong, but it's something like Rodrigo Salmona. Fact check it, Salmona. And it's an amazing kind of housing complex. And when I was there, I met up with a Colombian architect who then went in, and we went into his office, and I met his he's dead now, but went into and met his ex-wife. And then she went and took us, the 4 or 5 people that I was with, took us to her apartment, which was in that block. And there was a real, I've talked a lot today about richness of material and, 1 to 2 or 1 to 5 level of thinking in larger projects. And that had that. There was a real level of spatial complexity and success at all these different scales. It worked at a 1 to 2,500. It worked as a piece in the city of 10 million people, and it was like, and it worked as an icon in that particular. But then it worked at 1 to 200. It worked as a series of spaces between buildings, in a way that so many buildings that get procured and get built now don't.
Mm-hmm.
And then the entrance through to the lobby at 1 to 20, through to the way in which the flats were designed. And it was a very kind of rich kind of architectural experience.
Okay, well that's a perfect answer. Thank you very much for joining us. I can't remember what episode this is, but thank you everyone for tuning in and listening. Next week we have Soren Neilsen from Vandkunsten, so make sure to tune in then as well. Thank you.